it's difficult to get the right position. I'll come in and I'm like up here and yeah.
Yeah, I mean, at least I'm in a room that has better natural lighting than where I usually am at this hour, which is usually like
Yeah.
a dark little cave. So this is,
Excellent.
I at least got that right.
Great. So this is our 22nd niche conversation. Today I
Ooh.
am joined by Kateryna Barnes. You want to tell us more about yourself?
Hey, thanks, Simone. I'm Kat. I work and live in Edmonton, Treaty 6 territory, home of like many diverse, vibrant First Nations communities and Métis people. And I should point out, like, they are still here, still awesome, still doing it. It's not like this is traditional territory, it's their modern territory too. Like,
Mhm.
I work here. I am not. I'm a settler to this area. I'm Haudenosaunee, Ukrainian, and Scottish, but yeah, I'm a settler on this land. And when I'm talking about Inuit culture and people and whatnot, I'm also an outsider to that as well. I would like to point out, but that's why I try to cite mostly people from like internal to the culture, because otherwise I'm such an outsider on that.
Mhm. Yeah, so invited you here today because you had a piece on our website last week called Climate Apocalypse and Tagak. And that was based on, it was like an introductory piece to a Gothic Nature 2 article, longer article called Soundtrack to Settler Colonialism, Tanitagak's Music as Creative Nonfiction Horror. And I came across this on the internet and I was like, oh, this is so cool. We got to feature it. So,
Thank you. Someone read
um,
it. Yay!
yeah, it's always exciting when you realize someone read something you published. Eh? Um, womp womp academia.
I know, right? No one reads in academia.
So I thought we'd start off by talking about climate apocalypse and kind of defining what that is or how you personally view climate apocalypse.
Yeah, of course. So when I say climate apocalypse, I'm specifying that there's more than one way to have an apocalypse. Um, so, like for example, we could look at like just like our own environmental history and look at dinosaurs. That was not a climate apocalypse. That was a meteor impact. So apocalypse can come in many forms. It could come in the forms of like a genocide, or in this case, man-made climate change thanks to settler colonial industrial environmental devastation, which is going to bring multi-species extinction, melting of Arctic ice, and other horrible things. Um, so I kind of draw on that idea of like a climate apocalypse from um, an Inuk author, Sheila Watt Klute's Right to Be Cold. It's a kind of like a biography of for her, what it means to have the right to be cold as an Inuit person.
Mhm.
So yeah, there's more than one way to have an apocalypse, and they all suck.
Yeah, yeah. I feel like we've been talking about culturally, at least in the West, about apocalypse more in the past year. I feel like it's really um, emerged into the forefront
Yeah,
of discourse. So, and climate apocalypse is, I think, an important way of thinking about climate change, but it's one that perhaps more popular sources kind of shy away from because it's scary and
yeah,
kind of,
absolutely.
yeah,
It
yeah,
is so scary
yeah, very scary.
because it
Um,
seems so. It's a way to. It makes you feel very helpless. I think, right?
mhm,
Like it's this big giant thing, and you're just like one small little person,
mhm, yeah,
and it's coming for us all.
yeah.
Like it is scary. I'm scared.
Yeah, yeah, and this fear of the unknown and this feeling of being scared is kind of connected to horror media. And in
Yeah.
your short piece, you talk about how horror media is works as a translator.
Right.
And I thought maybe we could go into exactly what you mean there and yeah, why horror media is important.
Right. So this is like a big thing to unpack, so we might be here a while. Sorry, y'all.
No worries.
Um, to kind of start off with this idea of like the creative work being able to help us engage with like our internal turmoil, external turmoil. I like to look at the work of Pappas Chase Cree scholar Dwayne Donald, and one of the things he says is that, for example, that story shifts the narrative, which is kind of a way of saying that like you need to have sometimes a way to through the creative arts to kind of like change your perspective and to kind of transmit knowledge and to kind of help clarify things for even yourself, let alone your audience. And so that's where we're kind of getting the little bit of the translator part. And I mean, when we're talking of something as big as multi-species extinction and who knows what else,
Mm-hmm.
like this is it's not just like an individual death, like on a corporeal individual level. I had a classmate, Gamonari Laikam, she's awesome. She was raised Buddhist Thai, and the way she explained it is like, death doesn't scare me. Like I was raised Buddhist, like death doesn't scare me. Extinction scares me because there's no coming back from that. And
Mm-hmm.
for me, the framing is kind of stuck with me of like just how hard it is to wrap one's head around something as big and awful as like death is hard enough for a human to wrap our head around.
Mm-hmm.
Like I can fully acknowledge how hard that is. I had an aunt die from COVID in April, and that's been like messing with my brain, let alone like a multi-species extinction.
Mm-hmm.
So trying to wrap your head around that, you need aid on that. And I think that's kind of one of the ways where horror media kind of works. So kind of like anthropologist Ernest Becker says that like death is like kind of an all-consuming terror. Like when we have to look it in the face, like it's almost too much for our little human brains to comprehend.
Mm-hmm.
And he describes it as distinctly as a terror. And terror is like a mainstay of horror media. And horror media, by engaging with that terror, and instead of saying like, hey, like we like to avoid the fact that our death's coming.
Mm-hmm.
And horror media instead makes us look it in the face. And in the case of Tagak's music, she's not just looking at just death in some of her music. She's also looking at the climate apocalypse. She's
Mm-hmm.
looking at like the full multi-species extinction that my classmate referenced as being like, that's the scary thing. Like, and it's like, it's almost so much you can't wrap your head around.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I know personally, I think some of the most profound ego grief that I've experienced is when I've gotten caught up in the thoughts of extinction and maybe
Yeah.
watching videos of animals that are now extinct or what have you. But that's almost a removed kind of ego grief, right? It's like
Yeah.
those are animals that I never knew, like personally, I never existed on this planet with them. So
Yeah.
the thought of losing species that we now know, like we're currently living amidst, is even more profound. And I really appreciate this connecting horror media to this. And like I've only become to really appreciate horror media maybe in the last couple of years, because I was always so scared of it. If
No.
we're thinking about like traditional like film or what
Right.
have you, right? And I just always assumed it wasn't for me.
Right.
But maybe it actually is, and I've actually been enjoying it more and more. So that really connected. I really connected that part of your work as well.
Yeah, I grew up loving horror. I
Mm-hmm.
blame my father for that one. He
Yeah,
had quite an extended collection of horror books.
yeah.
It was I think it was seventh grade, I got in trouble at school because I brought a copy of The Exorcist to school to read, just like on my free time, like when you have free reading in class, and the teacher's like, where did you get this?
Yeah.
And I definitely, like, there was a phone call home. My dad's like, oh, yeah, that was on the shelf. Whatever. Like, so for me, I've always a certain amount of enjoyment as well as like comfort in horror. Like, it's a thing
Mhm.
from the childhood for me, which is not normal. I know
Yeah.
that. I had a weird childhood. I know that that's not normal. So for me, horror has always been kind of a way to work through what NiCHE calls like the ugly feelings, those like the aesthetic of those negative
Mhm.
emotions like anger, fear, anxiety, terror. And it's a way for it's I think it's Stephen King who says like we make up horrors to help us cope with the real ones. And so the difference is when you're that's fiction horror. That's generally what Stephen King's jam is. But when we kind of move it into the nonfiction horror, like some of Tanya Tagaq's music, where she's talking about like, you know, like the loss of like ice cover is going to catapult us into an era of rapid heating. There'll be no stopping it. Or the retribution will be swift. Our mother grows angry. We burn her body. Like it's heavy stuff. It's
Mhm.
heavy, heavy stuff. And it's pushing us from what Ernest Becker calls death avoidance and anxiety into having to actually face these ugly feelings and these fears and this terror and actually kind of try to grapple with, I'm going to say generally speaking, like the settler colonial industrial effects that we've experienced and
Mhm.
that sometimes we continue to perpetrate. Um, I say that as a person who owns a car. I hardly use it, but you know,
Yeah.
like there's a certain amount of complicity that we have in the situation we are in,
Mhm.
um, and it's terrifying. And that's where horror becomes like an kind of like an avenue to remind us that this is still here. Like you
Mhm.
can't just put it out of sight, out of mind, like I so desperately would like to with like many things.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's me rambling.
No, that's great. So you touched upon it a bit, Tanya Gak's music. So I thought we'd wrap it up maybe by specifically talking about how her work connects to climate apocalypse, horror, etc.
Yeah, so the idea came to me, and I trying to be trying to be a respectful person. I asked her directly on Twitter. I was like, "Would you consider some of your music to be creative nonfiction horror media about settler colonialism in general, let alone about a climate apocalypse?" And she's like, "Yeah, I guess so." I was like, "Okay, I'm gonna run with that." Like an academic, you get a ridiculous idea and you just go for it. And so this idea of like for those who aren't familiar with some of her music, it's she's modified like traditional Inuit throat singing, which is usually two women kind of in a competition with each other, and she does it solo, which is first of all makes it very very unique. And I not only is I think it a product of her being alone in Halifax when she was first getting into it as like an Inuk woman. But I also think it's like a fantastic critique on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirit folk of like, where's this other woman? But also it's a lot of her music takes a lot of inspiration from like metal and punk, which you'll see in her cover songs. Like she covers Nirvana's "Rape Me," she covers the Pixies' "Caribou," she covers Iron Maiden's "Run to the Hills." Like she clearly draws on like these sort of musical inspirations for her own stuff, even though it's more like throat singing, drums,
Mhm.
strings. But some of her music, it has like very peaceful, kind, gentle melodies. But the stuff that I was writing on are more the ugly feelings aesthetics. It's the aggression, it's anger, rage, heartbreak over trauma, essentially. Like,
Mhm.
and so, and we have to think about like with climate change, where are the more drastic symbols and signs of it happening on this planet? And a lot of it is on like either like at the equator or at the poles. And so for the Inuit people, losing ice is actually like first of all dangerous, straight up, it's dangerous. And secondly, it's changing how they know and understand the environment that they live with and work with and is a part of
Mhm.
who they are. And so it's existential, right? Like it's this existential horror that they are experiencing. And so Tagaq, as an Inuk woman, is expressing this. And she's engaging with like the ugly feelings aesthetic in some of this music and really kind of putting it in his face. Like I've seen like I know that some people are not into her music, and that's fair. Um, I've seen people say like, I don't like it. It's not like good music. It's not pretty. It's not catchy. And it's like, she's not trying to be pretty or catchy. She's trying to give the system and the reality the middle finger. And
Mm-hmm.
she's trying to point out like, you are culpable. We like settler colonialism and the industrialization and the continued environmental devastation is culpable for this. I don't
Mm-hmm.
care. Like, she kind of just wears that like rage and anger and heartbreak and stress so boldly, which, hint, I'm a huge fangirl of her. Surprise! Yeah, my paper's essentially academic fangirling of Tanya Tagaq. But she engages with these sort of things like the same way horror media does.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, I love it. I mean, but it's some of it's really dark. Like, for example, in the song Retribution, she says, like, we squander Mother Earth's soil. We suck out her sweet black blood to burn it. Um, you know, it's left us in smog. Like, we're trying to placate the fear of returning back into our mother. Like, it's this idea of like we are using we're trying to avoid our death, but we're actually probably speeding it up.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that's pretty horrific. That's pretty terrifying. I go back to the Becker definition of terror of like having to look death in the face and not avoid it. Yeah, it's terrifying. That's terror.
Yeah. Yeah.
Did I answer your
Um,
question? I'm so
yeah,
rambly.
no, that was fantastic. I'm just thinking about, yeah, so I also adore her music and I love how visceral it is. I love the emotions that it brings up in me.
Yeah.
Um, I find it interesting how much my cats hate it. They're terrified. um, but what also has always struck me is how uncomfortable it makes a lot of settlers and how they
Yes.
just don't get it. And
Yes.
they'll just be like, that's not music, or that's not good, as you mentioned. And it's
Yeah.
just I think it speaks to a lot of problems and some cultural divides and disconnects between settlers and indigenous people. That's a huge topic for another day,
Yeah.
but you touching upon
Yeah.
that. Yeah.
And I mean, she'd be the one to be able to speak for this best, but I get the energy I get from her is that she just doesn't care
Yeah.
about those opinions. She's like, maybe it's not for you. Like, I'm expressing the truth that I see, and if
Yeah.
that makes you uncomfortable, that's on you. And I have a lot of respect for that. That is bold energy that I wish I could channel more in my day-to-day life.
Hmm.
Like, I have a lot of respect for that.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, this was a great conversation, and I encourage everyone to check out your post on our site and also the article that's linked on there. It's really fantastic. I encourage you to check out Tanya Digak's music as well. It's
Yeah.
really good. Retribution, that video is just so good.
Yeah, she kind of gets the full show
Yeah,
aspect of it.
yeah.
Yeah.
And I've seen her in person as well, and it's
Yes.
just so good. So.
Yeah.
This is a
Thank you for
plug for
this.
both individuals. And thank you for joining me today, Kat. This was
Thank
great.
you for having me. This was fun. I was utterly terrified before because I've never done this
A lot of
before.
people are, but it's not that scary.
You're a good host for this. Thank you.
Thanks. Have a good day. Bye.
You too. Bye.